Everybody was Pac-Man fightin' on this 8th episode of Good Intentions. Among video game publishers and manufacturers alike, Nintendo commands the single greatest reputation for not playing by everyone else's rules. That's no coincidence. The company has made a concerted effort over the past decade to break away from the systems and expectations enkindled through decades of console wars and arms races. No other company would have pinned its hopes on the DS and Wii, though at the same time, no other company would have given us the Wii U either. Nintendo's willingness to break from convention results in both disasters and successes, and personally, I love that about them. I may not enjoy everything Nintendo does, but they sure don't make things boring, whatever they do. But Nintendo wasn't always the reckless, defiant, aggressively original creature we know and speculate about rampantly today. Back in their early days in the games industry, they were every bit as unoriginal as everyone else. Sure, we look back at Nintendo's arcade days and the early Famicom launch period and we see inventive masterpieces like Donkey Kong and Super Mario Bros., games upon which the company built both an empire and a reputation. And deservedly so, they were creative masterpieces like no one else had ever created. But you know, Nintendo developed, published, or manufactured a lot of games in the 8 or 9 years leading up to Super Mario. And they weren't all dazzling works of invention. On the contrary, outside of its giant hits and a few other notable works, Nintendo was every bit the derivative copycat that it works so earnestly not to be today. In fairness, so was everyone else back then. That's just how video games did it in those days. Nintendo's very first home video games were Pong clones, produced by Sharp Electronics. Their first arcade games largely consisted of Space Invaders knockoffs. Donkey Kong famously rose from the ashes after Invaders' clone Radarscope crashed and burned. But it's easy to forget that, hilariously, Radarscope was just one of 3 Invaders clones Nintendo produced that year. So when we come to the 8th chronological release for the Nintendo Entertainment System, Clu Clu Land, it should really come as no surprise that the game is basically a naked attempt to cash in on the biggest video game craze of the early 80s, Pac-Man. Arriving in Japan in November 1984 and debuting in America at the NES launch 11 months later, Clu Clu Land saw Nintendo tilling the exact same soil that every other game maker of the era had attempted to coax cash from. Pac-Man derivatives came in 2 forms during the arcade's golden era: utter ripoffs, or brave attempts to do Pac-Man 1 better. Clu Clu Land falls into the latter category, with the emphasis on attempt. This is not a work on par with Namco's standard-bearing Maze Chase classic. To its credit, though, it's way the heck better than any of Midway's post-Ms. Pac-Man hacks. However, there's more of a story behind Clu Clu Land than Nintendo made a Pac-Man clone. If you really dig into its history, Clu Clu Land ties into a fairly pivotal moment for Nintendo as a game maker. As Nintendo's business evolved throughout the 60s and 70s from playing card manufacturer to electronics company, President Hiroshi Yamauchi began to reorganize the company's employees into specialized divisions. The first of these, Research and Development 1, was established in 1970 under the auspices of Gunpei Yokoi, the creative savant whose Ultra Hand gadget gave Nintendo its first major success. A decade later, Yamauchi established the 4th and final of these divisions, Research and Development 4, in response to the success of Donkey Kong. By building an entirely new team, Yamauchi was able to elevate Donkey Kong's designer, a young illustrator named Shigeru Miyamoto, to a leadership position without snubbing any of the veterans at R&D 2, which focused on hardware design under Masayuki Uemura, including the NES and Super NES, and R&D 3, which focused largely on supplemental technology under Genyo Takeda, such as the save RAM and memory mapper chip that would become so essential to the NES's long life. R&D 4 would eventually go on to be known as Entertainment Analysis and Development, but in the short term, the studio focused its energies on creating arcade releases to follow on Donkey Kong, before shifting to Famicom development. The particulars of Nintendo's internal affairs in the early 80s are imperfectly chronicled. But, so far as I can tell, Miyamoto's R&D 4 group made the jump from arcade design to console games almost immediately upon the Famicom's Japanese debut in July 1983. Their last 2 arcade games, Donkey Kong 3 and Mario Bros., hit arcades throughout 1983, and April 1984 saw the Famicom debut of a game called Devil World. Two facts about Devil World jump out immediately. 1, it was evidently the very first game Miyamoto had designed exclusively for consoles, and 2, it's one of the very few Miyamoto games never to see a US release. We've touched on the latter point in previous episodes. Nintendo of America took a delicate touch to the US market right from the beginning, in order to avoid touching off firestorms of controversy in Reagan's reactionary and frequently xenophobic America. That meant no religious content in NES games, and Devil World was crammed full of Christian imagery, used in a loopy, nonsensical fashion, but undeniably Christian. Devil World incorporated iconography including Bibles, crosses, Satan, and soft-serve ice cream cones for some reason. These visual elements were far too integral to the game for simple sprite edits to ameliorate, since most levels were arranged around a central cross shape, and would need to be redesigned as well. You can definitely see the influence of Pac-Man on Devil World. The game includes 3 different level formats, and the first of them involves clearing dots from a maze while grabbing power-ups to protect you from roaming monsters. Curiously, though, Devil World adopts a mechanical compromise that you saw in many home ports of Pac-Man, a scrolling screen. In Pac-Man home conversions, a scrolling screen is often a warning sign to stay away. By removing the player's ability to take in an entire level at a glance, those ports deeply compromise the fundamental nature of the game. If you can't keep track of your progress, and the position of the ghosts at a glance, the game becomes much more difficult. Devil World, however, actually embraces scrolling as part of its fundamental design. You can only see a portion of the maze at any given time, and your window into the level scrolls around as directed by Satan, who stands at the top of the screen gesticulating commands to his minions. It's not an entirely successful idea, since the direction in which the devil points appears to be determined at random, and can lead to dead air time in which he guides the maze toward ground that you've already covered. Still, it's a pretty clever attempt to integrate something that in other games would be a compromise. Devil World's second mode works more or less like the first, except that instead of clearing the maze of dots, you need instead to find 4 Bibles scattered to the corners of the maze and carry them to a skull icon in the center of the screen. Once all 4 Bibles are in place, Satan retreats from the maze and lets you play a bonus round in which you're collecting icons. With the devil gone, scrolling in the bonus round is determined by the player. The maze is littered with arrow icons that direct the movement of the screen frame. All told, it's a fairly decent if not exactly timeless attempt to do the Pac-Man thing in a novel fashion. About half a year after Devil World's debut, Nintendo published its second Famicom maze game, Clu Clu Land. While the timing might give the impression that Nintendo's designers were stuck in a rut or spinning their wheels, it's important to realize that the 2 games were designed by 2 different divisions of Nintendo. Where Devil World came to us courtesy of Miyamoto's new R&D 4 division, Clu Clu Land appears to have been the work of the venerable R&D 2 or R&D 3. I say appears to because, as per usual, Clu Clu Land lacks anything resembling in-game credits, and no one seems to know who designed the game. Composer Hirokazu Tanaka, aka Hip Tanaka, has said he never worked on Clu Clu Land's music, and given that Tanaka was R&D 1's go-to guy for music in those early days, it seems safe to say that this was not an R&D 1 joint. The website The Kyoto Report, however, has pointed out the fact that the default initials in the arcade version's high score table line up with the initials of developers from R&D 2 and 3, which was often how devs signed games in the era before in-game credits. Most notably, the bottommost entry belongs to MU, presumably Masayuki Uemura, designer of the NES hardware and head of R&D 2. Whoever made it, what we have in Clu Clu Land is a game that belongs to the same general genre as Devil World, but frankly couldn't be more different. It's a faster, simpler game, yet one that despite its more straightforward design is considerably more difficult to master. The trickiest thing about Clu Clu Land is its control scheme. The game's name is an Anglophone interpretation of the Japanese title, Kuru Kuru Rando, Kuru Kuru being a Japanese onomatopoeia for rolling or rotating. And indeed, that's what you do in Clu Clu Land. Much like Pac-Man, your little round heroine Bubbles doesn't really have a resting state. She's constantly hurtling forward. What differentiates Bubbles from Pac-Man is that you have no direct control over her. Instead, you guide her through the maze by causing her to reach out and grab the posts scattered around the maze. By grasping a pole, you create a fulcrum point around which Bubbles revolves. She'll continue spinning in a 360-degree circle until you let go, at which point she'll continue moving ahead in the cardinal direction she's facing as you release the pole. So while you can't stop Bubbles altogether, you can at least arrest her forward momentum. Grasping a pole allows Bubbles to tread water, as it were, and to change direction as she cruises along through the maze. This makes for a much more challenging control scheme than Pac-Man's direct approach. The constant momentum of the protagonist means you can never let your guard down, and the fact that she navigates by altering her trajectory through clutching posts forces you to think a step ahead of your actions. For instance, you can't simply backtrack along your current route unless you bounce off a wall. To reverse direction, you need to grab a post and do a 180, which will send you flying along a channel parallel to the one you just skated through. And you need to keep the control scheme in mind, as the controller activates Bubbles' left and right arms individually relative to her position on the screen. The pull mechanic does have its advantages though. One of the two hazards you need to dodge in Clu Clu Land are vortexes that will suck Bubbles in if she passes over them, unless she happens to be holding onto a pole as she does so, in which case her grip keeps her from being drawn into the hole. The black holes often show up along critical paths, so mastering the ability to skirt past them becomes essential for survival as the level designs grow more complex. The game's other hazards, on the other hand, aren't so easily circumvented. In keeping with the underwater theme of Clu Clu Land, Bubbles has to complete each maze while avoiding a host of roaming sea urchins. While they tend to putter about somewhat aimlessly, the mobility of the sea urchins, combined with the unrelenting breakneck pace of Bubbles' movements, makes for a genuine hazard. Fortunately, Bubbles isn't as defenseless as your usual maze chase protagonist. She can fire sonar pulses straight ahead for a short distance. These bursts of sonic force will stun any sea urchin in their path. If Bubbles bumps into a stunned sea urchin, she'll send it careening into a wall, taking it momentarily out of play. While this powerful and unlimited attack might sound like a huge imbalanced advantage in Bubbles' favor, the rotational nature of her movement makes lining up bad guys more challenging than you might think. The greatest danger in Clu Clu Land comes from potentially smashing into a sea urchin while spinning around a pole, and your sonar blasts can't help you against an enemy that lurks around the corner. They also won't do you much good if you trigger one of the barriers hidden between certain posts. These rubber-like obstacles pop up as you pass over them, redirecting you back in the direction you came from. If a sea urchin happens to be hot on your heels when a barrier appears, Bubbles will carom right back into it before she has a chance to fire a defensive beam. Thankfully, the barriers aren't random. They're hidden, but there's a pattern to them, and as you learn the maze configurations, you become better at predicting and avoiding them. Really, it's something of a misnomer to refer to Clu Clu Land's stages as mazes. While some of them have obstacles fixed in place, be it barriers or black holes, most of the game's levels consist of a wide-open grid of poles. There are also no dots and very few objects to collect. Each level begins as a blank field with nothing but poles, sea urchins, and black holes visible. Your goal in Clu Clu Land is not to clear the maze of objects, but instead to fill it up by passing over spaces in which gold ingots have been hidden. And once all the hidden items have been revealed, you move on to the next stage. The ingots appear in patterns, such as hearts, submarines, and card suite symbols. Clu Clu Land has a fixed number of stage designs, 20 in total, divided into 4 patterns each for 5 sets of stages. You'll always see one of the same 4 patterns within a set, but the order in which patterns appear is randomized per game. You won't know which pattern you're currently revealing until you've passed over enough ingots to reveal enough of the design. As I've said before, the most common legacy of Pac-Man isn't mazes, but rather the concept of territory control, and Clu Clu Land plays around with this concept as well as any game of the era. It's an unusual game mechanic, but it works really well. Clu Clu Land is predictable, yet varied enough across sessions to keep players guessing. Once you get a handle on the available designs, you can become quite efficient at revealing all the ingots without wasted movements. All told, Clu Clu Land is an odd little game, combining a sort of sideways take on Pac-Man with a very challenging control scheme to create something with its own distinct personality. It doesn't seem to have gone over particularly well in the US though. You rarely hear it spoken about in glowing terms, and it's currently one of the 3 most expensive NES black box games on the collector's market, which suggests it's sold in rather small numbers. Nintendo seems to have a soft spot for it though. Clu Clu Land has resurfaced quite frequently through the years, everywhere from Virtual Console to Smash Bros. Nintendo poured an uncharacteristic amount of effort into the Versus System version of Clu Clu Land, where other Famicom to arcade conversions had seen modest tweaks, including a special bonus mode for Duck Hunt. Versus Clu Clu Land offered double the levels of the home release and even a new enemy type. That version of the game eventually did come to Famicom Disk System, making one of the very few instances in which a Versus System release took the journey back to console. It was a late bloomer though. It would be the next to last official Famicom Disk System release, coming to disc writer kiosks in 1992. And it would eventually make its way outside Japan too, under the name Clu Clu Land D. That wouldn't happen until 2001, when it appeared as an unlockable bonus game in Animal Crossing for GameCube. Ultimately though, Clu Clu Land's historic value is in its relationship to its fellow Nintendo first-party Maze Chase Pac-Man clone. As Clu Clu Land was produced by the R&D 2 or 3 division, you can see the different personalities and styles of Nintendo's internal teams taking shape as early as 1984. You look at Devil World and it's not all that great a game, but it bears the hallmarks of Shigeru Miyamoto and the group that would eventually become known as EAD. Though simple, Devil World still features a narrative framing device, literally. The game's mechanics reflect a simple story, with the devil visibly directing the movements of the maze, and a small team of minions carrying out his commands. It almost feels like a spiritual predecessor to the stage production theme of Super Mario Bros. 3. Clu Clu Land, on the other hand, feels nothing at all like an R&D4 or EAD production. It's a little unconventional, and it doesn't faff around with storytelling or framing, with the extent of its personality being the little cha-cha dance Bubbles performs as her score is tallied at the end of a stage. Instead, what you get is a challenging, fast-paced, highly technical take on the maze game. Not so friendly, but definitely a game that demands practice and mastery. R&D 2 and 3 took the lead on most of the early NES games, and you can see their personality in the likes of this and EXCITEBIKE, simple, functional, and also creative, technical demonstrations of the hardware's capabilities. R&D 4 would eventually go on to become the mainstays of NES game design, producing Super Mario Bros. In 1985, The Legend of Zelda the year after, and many classics to come. Before long, Miyamoto's team would become the face of the NES, and eventually of Nintendo. Here at the beginning, though, R&D 4 was still very much in the apprentice phase. It would be another year following the initial Japanese release of Clu Clu Land before the learner became the master with Super Mario Bros. Next on Good Intentions, the NES races to a compromise in America.